So it's an absolute delight to be joined by Alison Bechdel. Of course, well known to everyone as the author of the original text of the graphic novel of Fun Home, which is in its production at the Gate, running from July 6th to August 26th, is going to be directed by Roisin McBrien. Of course, music is composed by Janine Tesori, and the book and lyrics by Lisa Crone, of course. Everybody will probably be aware of the success of the original graphic novel and, of course, the multi-Tony winning musical adaptation. So I'm just really, really thrilled to actually get into some of the process and work and career and life of Alison. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. I'm very honored to be here with you, Una.
Where are you right now?
I'm at home in Vermont, in New England.
Excellent. Let's go right back, right back to some of the start of your early work. Can you give me some context as to what your life was like when you began Dykes to Watch Out For? Where were you living and hanging out?
Well, it's funny that you asked that because I've been thinking about that a lot lately, because this month is actually the 40th anniversary of that comic strip of the first published cartoon.
Wow.
And so I was just out of university in my early 20s, living in New York City, scrounging around, working temp jobs and trying to find my way in life. And I had just started drawing these silly drawings for my own amusement of Dykes to Watch Out For. That's what I called the first one. And even as I made that first sketch, I somehow envisioned a series, and I titled it Dykes to Watch Out For, plate number 27, as if, there were this big collection of images somewhere. But the strip came out of my own desire to see people like me and my friends reflected somehow in the culture, because I did not see people who looked like us when I looked at television or theater or anything. So I started doing it myself. And it was not a promising, career to undertake in the early 1980s, being a lesbian cartoonist, but very strangely, it has worked out for me.
When you look back at those early strips now, do you recognize, are you transported back, or does it feel quite alien? Obviously, it wasn't, completely autobiographical, but do you know what I mean about the world you're existing in?
I do. That's a really good question. They don't feel alien to me because I feel like I'm still, there's still a part of me. I'm in my 60s now. Like I just carry that all with me. So it doesn't seem as alien to me as it would to someone younger or someone who wasn't me. But to me, it's part of my whole, it's of a piece with who I am and all of my work.
We'll get into those kind of layers of memory and life in a little bit, but what kind of books and film and television was influencing you at that time? What was kind of thrilling you at that time?
I was reading a lot of lesbian and gay writers because I was just really hungry for, to see this kind of representation. I was fascinated with other people's coming out stories. And that's now kind of a passé genre, but for people of my generation, we didn't know we were gay until we were, late in high school or college. And all of a sudden, it was just this revelation that suddenly threw everything we had known about our lives into, upside down. So that's what happened to me. Like all of a sudden, I was reinterpreting everything in my whole life. As gay people, we don't have, families aren't explaining to us how to be gay, how to participate in gay culture. We stumble onto it if we're lucky. So I was very caught up in that in my early 20s, trying to, make up for the previous 20 years when I had no idea who I was. I was reading lots of feminist theorists. I was really into Adrienne Rich, not so much her poetry, but her essays, which I thought were so smart. Anyone who was writing a coming out story, I would read it. I read lots of feminist journals. And I was also reading a lot of books. I was sort of putting myself through my own version of graduate school and just reading all the classics that I had neglected up until that point. I was reading a lot of Virginia Woolf around that summer, as I recall.
When did you feel that Dykes to Watch Out For was kind of getting a following?
Immediately. It was really funny. So in the gay pride issue of this feminist newspaper 40 years ago, June of 1983, I had my first cartoon published, and I went to a dance the following weekend, and everyone was like, "Did you make that cartoon? Did you see this cartoon in the paper?" It was crazy. It was like this instant gratification. It was very amusing. And of course,
this was happening in every medium. There were playwrights suddenly writing about their experience as lesbians, novelists and short story writers, and everyone was, throwing themselves into this self-representation. And so comics was, it's very accessible. It's visual, so it was easy for everyone to see and recognize. And it egged me on. It was so exciting. It was kind of like when I was a little kid in school, like drawing was my thing, and that's how I would make friends. I would draw little pictures for people because I had no social skills. So it was sort of a continuation of that.
When you embarked upon Fun Home, then I'm interested in, not before we get to kind of the literal and physical composition of it, the idea, because obviously writing about the self is always radical, and this was particularly so. I'm interested in the imaginative process of when you decided, no, this is something that I'm going to do. I'm going to pull on this thread now.
It was a project that was very insistent for me for a long time. In fact, my father died when I was 19. That's what the book is about, is his death. And within a year of that very traumatic event, I had a kind of perspective on it. I could see that it was a really good story. That it was a story about these two different generations of gay people growing up in this same small town, but at different points in history, so that my father's life had, was ruled by these earlier historical constraints, and my life had been freed up. I had this possibility of liberation thanks to what had happened in between my coming of age and my father's coming of age, which was the, gay liberation movement.
Mm.
So I wanted to write about that. And I also knew instinctively that I somehow needed to write about it, that this crazy brief period surrounding my own coming out, my learning about my father, and then my father dying suddenly, probably of suicide. That was a lot to unpack, as the young people say. Well, I guess as everyone says now. I didn't learn to say unpacking until quite recently. And I needed to figure that out for myself. And I knew that the way I figure things out is through writing. And even though I'd never written anything like that, I just felt very drawn to do it, I felt compelled to tell this story. And eventually I did. I didn't begin it until I was almost 40. So it was like a full 20 years after my father's death, which was an interesting time marker too, because at that point he had been part of my life for equally as long as he had not been. And I think some sudden shift in perspective enabled me to see it as a story and to go to work on it.
I think that's always interesting when that amount of time passes where something that occurred is a smaller chunk of time than your distance from it. There's something in that turns something in the brain.
Yeah, definitely.
In the early stages of the process of writing the work, drawing the work, illustrating the work, what was that process like? Like, did you work out a story structure first or a manuscript first, or how did it unfold?
I had no idea what I was doing, and it unfolded very, very slowly. When I was younger and had a notion that I would one day tell this story, I just assumed I would do it with words, in prose. But over those 20 years, I had become a cartoonist. And in fact, the whole world of comics had shifted kind of seismically when Art Spiegelman's book Mouse about the Holocaust came out, his graphic memoir about the Holocaust, which meant people were starting to tell all kinds of different and difficult stories in comics format. And so it just made sense to me, oh, okay, definitely this is going to be a graphic book. So I was used to writing comic strips, which are these very small, tightly constrained little stories, mostly dialogue with characters. But what I was doing was writing about my real life, my real family, and I had no idea how to do that. It took me a really long time to sort it out. I didn't consider myself a writer. Part of the whole process of writing the book was accepting some sort of like aesthetic directive. I feel like what writing Fun Home, sorry, this is complicated. I worked on the book for years. It took 7 years start to finish, but at some point in the middle of the writing, actually, as I was writing the last page, when the ending of the book came to me, I suddenly realized what it was about. It was not just about my relationship with my father around his sexuality or my sexuality. It was about learning to become an artist from my father. And everything else was sort of secondary to that, I suddenly realized. He had been always restoring our house. He was very into all kinds of design and loved literature. He didn't have a specific art form, but he was very artistic in everything that he did, and was always demonstrating to me, like, this is how you think aesthetically. This is how you see things and make decisions and make projects happen. And so it's a kind of the story of becoming an artist, as well as much as it's about anything else. Sorry, I feel like I've wandered off.
No, not at all. I mean, it's interesting because obviously one of the things that people say about Fun Home, and it's so true, is how it changed the form in many ways that you're operating within. And I'm just interested in often I think, especially with queer people, the existing forms are not necessarily the ones that our stories can fit into, and we end up kind of molding outside of the edges. Did you have any kind of crises within that when you realized that you were probably, this is a terrible pun, but like kind of coloring outside of the lines of what already existed of the form?
I feel like my entire process of writing that book was a kind of crisis of one kind or another. I mean, the big issue for me was, how do I write this story that reveals these family secrets? How do I make these family secrets public without, killing my poor mother? So a lot of what was happening for me was navigating that with her, letting her know I was going to do this, showing her drafts of it, which was always excruciating, was always really painful for both of us to go through that. And also, there was an aesthetic layer to that too, because my mother was like the critic who lives in my head. My mother also loved literature and poetry and considered herself very, she was a writer. She wasn't actually a professional writer, but she taught English. She wanted to be a poet. So my head was just full of my mother's critiques. And here I was, not only showing her my book, but it was a book that was exposing her to the world. So that was a whole crazy process, coming to some sort of truce about the fact that I was going to do that.
What lessons did you learn about that balance, like the balance of telling the truth, obviously, about one's life and about the lives of other people in terms of how you interpret them, which is also your story? There doesn't necessarily need to be a deference in many cases or things like that, but and so that balance of telling that truth and then protecting yourself, within that.
Well, I'm not sure what I learned. I mean, I feel like, yes, it was my story and I knew I had a right to tell it. And I also feel like, to a certain extent, our parents who bring us into the world don't deserve immunity. Like I did try to keep my brothers out of the book as much as possible because I didn't want to, intrude on their real lives. But with my mother and my father, I felt like that is okay to do. This is they brought me here. They set up these circumstances. I'm allowed to talk about it. And my mother, I don't think she cared much for that theory, but she did respect my need to tell the story. She understood what I meant when I said, I need to tell this story. And that was a great gift that she could give me that.
I think one of the things that informs a lot of your work is memory. And memory is a difficult thing to navigate when things go unsaid, or there are these like emotional mysteries that we can kind of begin to find out about when we untangle and kind of reconstruct our version of events or our truth. And Fun Home is a really great example of that untangling, I feel. And there's so many. I mean, recently another untangling, All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, the Laura Poitras documentary on Anne Golden, really struck me as an amazing example of that as well.
That was remarkable how much they delved into her family situation to explain her work. Yeah,
really incredible. I'm wondering, like, what you learned about memory while creating Fun Home. I mean, it's kind of a big question because it's such a massive topic, but yeah, I'm just interested in that.
Well, I've always had a pretty good memory, like a pretty vivid memory. And I started writing down the memories that I felt had some kind of relationship to this story. That's how I began the whole project, just writing down memories, refining them, delving into them, expanding them. It's interesting because now that I've done that, now that I've written about these memories, I don't have them anymore. Like erased them somehow in writing them. I mean, I still have them, but they're not as immediate or vivid as they once were. And this reminds me of something that my mother said, not while I was writing Fun Home, but while I was writing my next memoir, which was about her. She said to me, "You have a pretty good memory," as if she were accusing me of exactly the opposite, that I was making all this stuff up. But I do have not a photographic, but a very sharp memory, at least of my childhood. So whether other people believed those memories or not was another matter. And then I would hear stories from other people, like my brothers would contribute information or tell me a story of something that they remembered. And it was amazing to realize that other things were going on all the time that I had no idea about. Other people had their own lives, their own version of this family. I arrogantly went into the project thinking I was going to tell the truth of this family. And now I see that it was just one of the 5 truths. So I learned that. But I also learned that while I wanted to hew as closely to the truth as I possibly could, I also had to tell a story. You know, I had to create a narrative out of these quite, you know, seemingly random and disconnected events. And part of how I did that was, well, as well as my memories, I also had my diaries. And I think my habit of keeping a diary is part of what has helped me to have clear memories, because if you write stuff down, you're, you know, imprinting them, reinforcing them in your mind. But when I looked at my childhood diaries, they were, you know, they were a child's reality, very simplistic and just talking about the surface. Yet I found they were still helpful, if only to sort of corroborate what was going on. Like, oh yeah, Dad was away that weekend. What was happening then? Or this was that time Mom told me we might have to move because Dad had gotten arrested. And I was able to use that evidence from the diaries to weave together with my actual memories to have more of a structure for the story.
It's interesting what you're saying about once you kind of turn those memories into art, they kind of leave in a different way. It kind of makes me think about how much of memory is about containment, you know, containment within your own head, your own history. And then when you kind of transform it, I suppose, into art, it dissipates into something else.
Yeah, I was surprised to read something Virginia Woolf wrote in one of her memoir pieces about how when she wrote to the lighthouse, it got her own mother out of her head. And I realized that's what happened to me when I wrote Fun Home. It like took this mythic figure of my father who was just always weighing down on my consciousness. It just took him off of my hard drive. And it was a great relief. I was freed up to think about other things, to have other kinds of feelings.
When were you first approached for Fun Home to be adapted?
Within a year after it was published, pretty early on. And I just thought making a musical out of that book was the craziest thing I had ever heard. But I said, fine, I agreed to it. I think partly because partly out of naivete, I didn't know how badly such a project could go awry. I'm very lucky that it didn't, that such a beautiful musical got made from the book. But I didn't know anything about musical theater, really. I just thought, well, if you people think you can turn this into something, have at it. Not really thinking I would be able to do it. I did know when that offer came in that Lisa Crone was who they wanted to write the book. And I knew Lisa, I knew her work, and completely trusted that she would get it. So it wasn't like I was going blindly into it. I knew she would be great.
When you saw the whole thing completed, I'm not sure when that moment was for you, whether that was in a rehearsal or something like that. How did you feel?
This is a story that's hard to even tell because I've now told it so many times. I don't remember. I've like, it's gone. But I will say that the play was in production for years. I had almost forgotten that this was even happening. It was 3 full years, or maybe even 4, before I saw the script that Lisa had written, which was hard for me to read. I'm not, I'm not someone who knows much about drama. It's hard, reading a script is a whole art to it itself, to know how to envision what it's going to look like on stage, which I couldn't do. But there were also a few songs at that point. I got the script and some songs, and I just felt excited and deeply moved, especially by the music, which is just acts on you in some way that you can't explain. Many of those early songs didn't make it through to the current version, but they were beautiful and haunting, and I felt like this team was creating a really accurate adaptation of the book. And adaptations are so tricky. They so rarely get at the essence of the original thing, but I feel like Fun Home really did.
Mm. After Fun Home, the book, not the musical, came Are You My Mother? And then mid-pandemic, The Secret to Superhuman Strength. And I hope you don't mind me saying this, because even though I absolutely adore Fun Home and it's so established in culture, and Are You My Mother is so brilliant as well, there's something about The Secret to Superhuman Strength that makes me kind of feel like it's your finest work to date.
That's so nice to hear. Thank you.
It's like that, again, that idea of exploring the self, and really trying to get at very clear kernels of meaning that are extraordinarily complex to mine. It made me think about the amount of work and thinking that we all try and do, that goes into attempting to discover the meaning of life through the meaning of our own selves. Can you tell me a little bit about how you feel about that now? Because it's kind of an epic. It's like an epic of the self.
I always have a bad feeling about whatever my most recent book has been. It's very hard for me to stop seeing all the flaws and what I could have done better and how I completely failed to do what I originally set out to do. I felt that with Fun Home. I felt it with Are You My Mother? And then it goes away. Eventually I'm able to rehabilitate the book and see it for what it is. But I'm still a bit feeling like I didn't quite succeed in Superhuman Strength. I feel like everything's there, but I didn't quite knit it together enough. I mean, how do you show the course of your whole life? That was a challenge. I wanted to tell not so much the story of my life, but how I think about my life, how I've come to inhabit my life and use my life for something good. That's my hope anyway. See, now I can't even talk about it. But I'm really glad that you like it. That means a lot. It means a great deal.
Is it appropriate to push back at you about your own work in this moment, or your own interpretation of it, just because you say this thing about like, you know, when you started out writing Fun Home and you didn't realize what, you know, you have this other interpretation then when it unfolds, right? That it's about something else. It's not just about this relationship with the father. I think because of the breadth of time and detail and like personal interrogation in Superhuman Strength, that the reader is actually extracting the various meanings in the gaps in the timeline
Yes.
for wherever they're at. So it does something
Yes.
different again that's actually off the page and in the reader's self.
Well, if that is happening, that is amazing, because yeah, I'm counting a lot on the reader putting these things together. If I had done that myself, it would have been a much longer book and a much duller book, because the excitement, I think, is in making those synaptic connections yourself as you're reading a book. Like, oh, that reminds me of my attempt to do this or that, or oh, I read that book too and I couldn't figure out what it was about. All that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's a very like participatory sort of reading experience.
Right.
Ideally.
Is it strange having like the intimacies of your own experience, your familial experience, your kind of life experience interpreted by others, staged by others, read by others? Is it hard? How do you kind of come back to yourself?
It is deeply strange, but at the same time, whatever my own personal neurosis or I don't know. I have always had a need to track myself, to keep a diary, write a comic strip, write a memoir. Like I have this compulsion to explain myself and somehow demonstrate who I am. I don't know, we could talk about why that's so, but we don't need to do that right now. That is something about me. So in a way, it doesn't seem weird. It's like, oh yeah, here's the story of my life. Here's a play about my family. It's in some kind of weird solipsistic way, it makes sense to me. Lisa Crone used to joke when Fun Home was on Broadway, and I would go to see other plays, she would say, was it odd to see An American in Paris when there was no one in your family on stage? So in a funny way, it isn't weird. It's both weird and completely not weird to have all this personal information out there.
Have you found yourself connecting more with musical theater?
No. I mean, I live up in the woods. I don't go to New York that often. It's just not really my thing. I feel bad saying that.
That's okay. Just a couple more questions. I know you are very, very busy working at the moment, so I appreciate your time.
Oh, sure.
Obviously, the Bechdel test has gone on this like crazy journey in terms of being so shorthand for so many different things. Is that a bizarre thing, having just written something or drawn something that became condensed into this like phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, it no longer seems quite as strange as it once did, because I've gotten used to that too. But yeah, when in the early 2000s, I started hearing people or seeing on the internet all these mentions of the Bechdel test, it was just so funny. It's taken from a comic strip I wrote in 1985 when I was, still quite young. And it was just a funny joke among me and my lesbian friends. Like, should I say what the test is? Should I explain it?
Yeah,
Probably.
go for it.
I wrote a comic strip about two women who were trying to find a movie to go to. And one of them said, well, I have a rule. I can only see a movie if it has at least two women in it who talk to each other about something besides a man. And this was something an actual friend of mine said to me, and I thought it was really brilliant and really funny, because hardly any movie fulfilled those criteria. You might finally land on a movie that had two women in it who spoke to each other, but it was always about the man or somebody's father or son or boyfriend. So, that was just a little lesbian joke back in the 80s. But a younger generation of women stumbled onto it and felt like it was really expressing something succinctly about movies that they were learning. I think it was actually film students who started this. And it just somehow caught on in this weird viral way, because it does explain a complicated idea in a very simple way. But I never meant for it to be some kind of rule,
Mm. Well, I think explaining complicated ideas in succinct ways is definitely a key pillar of your work, I'd say.
Well, of comics too. Comics is a great way of doing all that.
Yeah, right. Yes, of course. We're living in this strange time right now where, lauded writers such as yourself and so many other people are coming up against this moral panic, which is obviously extraordinarily dangerous in terms of books being banned from libraries, from schools, all this kind of thing, including your work on occasion. What do you think that says about the times that we're living in right now?
Oh man, what is the matter with people? Didn't they take history? Don't they know how bad this is? It's crazy. I mean, and it's not just here in the US. It's clearly there's this authoritarian craze going on around the globe. I don't know. I think maybe humans are just going mad because we're, despoiling our habitat, and we know we're going to go extinct if we don't do something differently. So we're just melting down and behaving in the worst possible way. I don't know what's happening in the world. I'm sorry, I don't have a coherent answer for this, because it's crazy. I mean, it's so much just about very, very cynical politics. At least here in the US, these people are banning all kinds of books about race, about sexuality, about gender, because they're threatened by it. But then it's just whipped into a frenzy by these weird conservative politicians who are outdoing one another to be as vile as possible. And gay people, and especially young trans people, are taking the brunt of it. It's crazy.
As I'm thinking of something Fran Lebowitz said once, where I think it was, nothing spreads as fast as a bad idea.
That's pretty accurate. Yeah.
What are you working on right now, if you can say?
I'm working on another book. It started out as another memoir. It was going to be a memoir about money, or at least the role of money in my life, which I would then use to talk about, bigger ideas about money and capitalism and all of that stuff. But then I realized I didn't want to write another memoir. I'm so tired of having to write these searching, accurate things about my real life. So I'm just kind of making it up. I'm still a character in this story, but I'm a fictional character with all kinds of traits and history that are not actually true, and it's very freeing and fun.
I was about to ask, that must be quite liberated. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to give an example. In this book, I run a pygmy goat sanctuary, which is not something that I do in real life at all, but it does seem like a sort of fun thing to do, to have those little goats running around.
Yes, indeed. A friend of mine who actually has some pygmy goats. I can already feel her anticipation of this. But finally, a lot of people are going to be coming to the show at the Gate in Dublin. Many of whom, I say most of whom, will be seeing it for the first time. This is kind of a trite thing, but I sometimes feel like maybe it's worth asking, in terms of, because the work is so personal ultimately, like, what do you think what do you think you'd like people coming to the show to take from it as a piece of work now that it's kind of has spanned forms?
Well, I know that when I would sit in on performances when it was running on Broadway, it was amazing to see how emotional people found it. And obviously, it's a very peculiar, particular story about a queer daughter of a closeted bisexual man who ran a funeral home. But what people were responding to was not the particulars of that story. It was the idea of telling the truth about a family, about something that people, for whatever reason, feel like they can't talk about. And most families, I used to think it was every family, but I've since learned there are some functional families in the world. But many families think that by not talking about stuff, somehow that's going to help, or that's going to be a good idea. That is absolutely never a good idea. And I think everyone feels this sense of liberation at witnessing a family where the secret is said out loud.
Well, here's to more secrets being said out loud, Alison.
Thank you, Una. What a delight to speak with you. This was a great interview. Thanks.